I'll be reading verses 16 through 21. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, Jesus went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing."
Good morning. So there was a Texan. You could start laughing now, sorry. And he was a horse rancher. And the pulpit moves. Okay, should I move with it? Okay. He heard about this old Indian guy up in Wyoming, up on my wife's reservation, and he heard that he had the best horses around. And so he decided to take his trailer up there, knock on the guy's door, and buy one of his best horses. So he knocks on the door, the screen door's kind of hanging off, and old Indian man comes out and he says, "What can I do for you?" He says, "I want to buy your best horse." He says, "Well," said, "they're all up in the corral right over there, but except for that one over here, don't worry about him. He don't look so good." So right away that Texan began to think, well, this guy's probably got his best horse over there for somebody else. I'm going to try and buy it. So he goes over and he starts looking at it, and the old Indian man yells out to him. He says, "I'm telling you, that horse don't look so good." He looks him over, looks him in the mouth, and finally says, "I'll buy this horse from you." And he says, "Okay." So he gives it to him, and he said, "I'm selling him to you, but I don't think he looks that good." He says, "Okay." So he loads him up. He calls his friends. He says, "Let's have a barbecue when I get there. We're going to have a big, celebration. I bought one of the best horses around." He goes down, and he starts to unload that horse. Well, that horse starts bumping into everything. He gets mad, and he loads the horse back up. He drives all the way back to Wyoming. He knocks on the old Indian guy's door, and he says, "Hey, you sold me a blind horse." And the guy says, "I told you 3 times, you don't look so good." So we're going to talk about how we're looking today. The message is entitled "The Power of the Wild," and it's taken out of all of Luke 4, actually, but that's a lot of scripture, and I hope you know the story. Basically, the story is that Jesus goes out into the wilderness, and he fasts and he prays, and he's tempted, and he comes back to his hometown, and he starts reading out of an ancient scroll, the Isaiah scroll, and that scroll is sort of some of the expectations of where he's reading is that this person will come along and restore justice and restore shalom and restore everything good that Israel had going for it at one time. And then he closes the scroll and he says that's today this is fulfilled. And then they start talking about him, and it kind of like, well, this is Joseph's son. I don't know about that. This can't be happening. And then Jesus tells them a story about a couple foreigners. And he says there was a widow in Zarephath who, Elijah visited, and she was starving. It was during a time of fasting, and God cared about her. And then he told about Elisha and visiting and healing centurion, an oppressor at that time in Israel, Syrian captain, and named Naaman. And he says, there's a lot of lepers in Israel, but God showed up for these other people. And that's the context of the story. So I want us to examine it just a little bit. So for a Native American, when they read that Jesus goes out for 40 days in the wilderness, in the wild, they know exactly what's happening. It's what we call a vision quest. And why do people go on vision quests? To seek a vision, right? Right? To find out what it is that's going to be paramount in their own lives. Sort of from this point on, what's my purpose? What am I doing here on this earth? And they ask Creator to show. And why in the wild? Why don't you just go pray in the synagogue for 40 days and fast? Ask yourself that question. The Lakota Kalahambaleche means to go out and seek a vision. And so Jesus is seeking a vision for his life and for the movement that will follow him. And so I think a lot of us say we're part of that movement. So we should be interested in what he comes up with, right? His motives are tested, and to decide, well, is this something that he's just doing for himself, or is this something that's bigger, something that's for others as well? And he goes out, and he looks around, and he's tempted, but I don't think anybody could be tested for 40 days. So let's be generous and say half of that time he was being tested. What was he doing the other half? Pretty well get an answer by reading the rest of the Gospels, because all he wants to talk about is creation. I mean, there were lots of technologies in Jesus' day. There was, Roman chariots and aqueducts and crossbows and all those things, but there's no record of him talking about those things. But what he talks about are trees and birds and flowers and seeds and soil and all of those things. And I believe that this time in the wilderness had a deep effect on him. He had to go outside. He had to get with creation in order to be taught from our greatest teacher, our first and longest lasting teacher, creation. And he learns from it. And somehow he connects it, his time out there. He connects his whole vision to this ancient system of what I call the Shalom Sabbath Jubilee construct. This whole idea, because that's exactly what he talks about when he comes back and announces it to his hometown. This idea of the Sabbath, which were not just for days, right? Which were also for years, and also, set 1/7 of your land aside. Now, here's an agricultural community, and think about that. 1/7 of their land is set aside for each, and seeds grew at that time. They weren't GMO, They were volunteers, what we call volunteers. And why? For the poor, for the disenfranchised, for what was known as the widows, the orphan, and the immigrants. Because they were the people who didn't have any standing in that society. They were the people who were automatically disenfranchised. And so there's this whole system set up so that, and then they would also forgive debts along the way. And then on the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, great day of the Lord as he calls it, all debts are forgiven, all prisoners are released, and all land goes back to its original owners. I don't know if we're ready to practice that yet or not, but I'm for it. Yeah. So he's connecting his time out there in his vision quest with this ancient system. He's looking back to what his ancestors were about, and it was also for the wild beast. It says in a number of places, for the wild ox, for the wild donkey, etc. And so apparently, the system was set up to care about all of creation, right? Not just human beings, we are part of it, but for everything. And so Jesus is getting this vision, and he's out there in the wilderness, and he's connecting it to this ancient system, because that's exactly what he comes back and he begins to talk about. He reads from Isaiah 61, which talks about all these things, which talks about, and then there was also a personal side too. It was like, oh yeah, and when you're harvesting, don't glean the edges of your field. Why? For the same reasons, to take care of people. These are safety nets, right? So that the most disenfranchised and marginalized and oppressed in society don't fall through to the bottom. So it's both systemic, structural, in other words, political, and personal. So this is Jesus' big vision. And he comes back and he announces it, and then he tells this whole story about, these foreigners. One was a widow, one was an immigrant, a foreigner. And so it got two of the three, and I argue that the next thing that happens when he says that God has no favorites, basically, when he says God is not exclusionary, is that they try to kill him in his hometown. And I thought, well, how kind of keen of Luke to pick up, here's the widow from Zarephath, here's Naaman the Syrian, who's the foreigner, and Jesus is about to become the orphan. That holy triad that represents everyone who's disenfranchised. The movement that he starts would be marked by love, be marked by acceptance. It should have been marked by an embracing of all creation, except for we talked about the dualism that prevented that in the Western worldview, and hopefully we can repair that breach. And it would talk about, if we looked at the words of Jesus and the stories of Jesus, a love and a respect and an understanding of all creation. And so I look at this chapter in Luke as sort of the premier message for all of us. If we want to follow Jesus, if we want to understand his life, then we have to understand his vision. And it has to do with creation and embracing the whole community of creation. And it has to do with justice and safety nets and structure. And our personal lives become a byproduct of doing the right thing, right? So we do it for others, but we get something out of it as well. And that's what the movement is supposed to be. But, I think we're in trouble. I don't think we're looking that good. So we need change, and not just in our personal lives. We need structural change. And that means movement. That means grassroots movement, really. It means political movement. It means using every resource that we have to bring about the kinds of change of a movement that Jesus started and left in our hands. There's a Cherokee story, it goes like this. Back, way back, there was just this one little place, and it was the top now of a place we call Blue Mountain, and that's where all the animals were. But they were a lot bigger than they are now, and so the animals were beginning to run out of room, and everything around them was surrounded by water. And so they got together in their council, and they said, what are we going to do? And they said, we don't know. Let's go to Creator and ask Creator, hey, what can we do? Can you give us more land? So Creator thought about it. So I'll tell you what, if one of you will go to the bottom of the water, down to the bottom of the ocean here, and bring up some mud, then I'll take that mud and I'll spread it out and I'll make a bigger place for everyone. So they got together and they said, well, who's going to go? And so right away, Grandmother Turtle, who was the oldest and the wisest, she said, I'll go. Well, they kind of looked around and thought, she's pretty old and slow. And maybe there should be someone else. Grandma Turtle, just hang on, let's see if there's someone else. And so right away, the muskrat, or the duck, I'm sorry, the duck, Mrs. Duck says, I'll go. And so Mrs. Duck goes out, and I got it mixed up with the Ojibwe story. They, I think, took it from us, so I'm going to get my animals right here. So Duck goes out, and she tries diving, and all of a sudden she pops back up, and she tries diving again, and she pops back up, and one more time, and she pops back up, and she comes back kind of embarrassed, and she says, I guess I'm a lot better floater than I am a diver. So they're like, okay, well, who else could do it? So Grandmother Turtle steps up again and says, I'll go. I'll go get the mud. And this time they sort of just ignore her, and they say, who's the best diver around? And so they look to Otter. Otter's the best diver and swimmer around. And so they see Otter down the beach, and they walk down to Otter, and they say, hey, Otter, would you go down and get some mud for us at the bottom of the water? So Otter says, sure. He jumps in, he takes off, and 1 day passes, 2 days pass, 3 days pass. On the 4th day, they're still looking for Otter, and all of a sudden somebody looks way down the beach, and Otter's sitting on his back, and he's eating a fish. So they'll all walk down the beach, and they say, Otter, where's the mud? And he's like, the what? The mud you were going to get for us. Oh, yeah. Well, on my way, I saw a fish, and I started chasing it. It took me a couple days. And what was I supposed to get again? So they were like, oh, my gosh. So they finally said, one more time, we've got to have somebody who can really qualify to get the mud. And Grandmother Turtle said, I'll go get the mud. And this time they completely ignored her. And Beaver steps up, and Beaver says, you know what? Says, I'm a good diver. I'm a good swimmer. I don't eat fish, and I don't ever play, so we don't have to worry about that. So Beaver goes, and, for 6 days, Beaver's gone. They're looking for him. Nope, no sign of her. Finally, on the 6th day, Beaver comes back, and she says, there's no way anybody can get it. It's too deep. We just have to forget it. And so Grandmother Turtle just walks through the crowd. She slowly dives in, and there she's gone. And so they can't stop her. So 1 day passes, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. It's finally on the 7th day, Squirrel, who was way up in the tree, spotted Grandmother Turtle, and she was floating up to the top, slowly. Legs extended, head extended, tail extended. She gets to the top. And Grandmother Turtle was dead. And so Beaver and Otter and Duck all swim out and bring her back and lay her on the beach, and all the animals are surrounding her, and they're really, really sad. Well, 1, because of Grandmother Turtle's death, and 2, because there's no mud, and they can't fix their problem. And so all is lost. And then someone says, look at in Grandmother Turtle's hand. There's something in that. She's holding something. And so they peel back her claws, and sure enough, there's a little ball of mud right there. And so they take that mud to Creator, and they tell Creator what happened. And Creator begins to spread that mud all out. And in honor of Grandmother Turtle, he makes it in the shape of a turtle. We call it Turtle Island. And if you look at it at the right angle, it looks like a turtle, all of North America. And but the animals are really impatient, right? So they asked Grandpa Buzzard. They said, "Hey, would you, go out there and flap your wings and dry this off for us a little bit?" And so he flew across, and everywhere he put down his wings was a valley, and everywhere he'd bring them up was mountains, and he was flying, and all of a sudden it was like all mountains and valleys, and he got out there to Iowa, Illinois, what we back west say one of the I states, or Kansas or somewhere, and they sent somebody and said, hey, Grandpa Buzzard, coast a while, So that's why they're all flat, today. And then he began to, flap his wings again. So when our kids were in school many years ago, they would often ask us, as Native parents, to come in and talk about different things. And it was almost always, the month of November, and almost always around Thanksgiving, right? But so I would tell that story sometimes, and one time a little Indian boy, probably, 8 years old, I said, so what do we learn from that story? And he said, they should have listened to the elder to begin with, because the elder had the wisdom to fix it. And so our challenge today, in the dominant culture that holds most of the power, most of the money, most of the influence, is to look to indigenous peoples who are the elders on this land, who've lived here for 60,000 plus years without destroying it, who had their own systems of taking care of the poor, the disenfranchised, who had their own restorative justice processes. And they really have the answers that we're looking for. But we need to listen to the elders, just like Jesus did. Thank you. So, would you like me to give the closing something? No? Okay, no.